Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Chris Saunders. He's the leader of Public Sector Solutions Engineering at Wiz. Chris, good to have you with us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Let's talk about zero trust. That is still very much active as an activity in the government. People still pursuing that whole idea for their cybersecurity. And now we have the multi-cloud environments becoming more and more prevalent. What about zero trust in the multi-cloud era?
Well, it's interesting. When the government first went on the journey of zero trust, is very much about the devices the government used to access applications, the endpoints, the phones, very much focused on sort of that use case. As the government has moved more and more to the cloud, we still can apply those same zero trust principles, but to the cloud infrastructure. And in the cloud infrastructure, these are all the things that people need to build to build those apps that those government employees, soldiers, warfighters use to access in the zero trust model. So when we talk about zero trust, we're talking about zero trust for the cloud and the cloud infrastructure. And I think there's really three key areas there that we focus on. And one is visibility. You have to understand what you have in the cloud. And if you don't have that fundamental component down, you're going to struggle with zero trust. And this is true of any security program. You have to know what you're going to assess for risk. And then being able to drive analytics across that to understand what's out there, what shouldn't be there, what's allowed to be there, what you haven't looked at yet. So that's one of the key things that we look at from a zero trust perspective in a multi-cloud world. To add on to that, you must be able to do that across multiple cloud providers, your Amazons, your Azures, your Googles, even your Oracles of the world, because you have to understand across all those, because a lot of the agencies are using a multi-cloud environment in their journey to the cloud.
Therefore, then the clouds have to be on a zero trust basis among one another, because sometimes there is transfer among the clouds on behalf of the agency. Would that be accurate to say?
100%. And what we often see is that you have this idea of developers building these cloud native applications. And one of the benefits of that is that you can move those apps between any cloud, maybe based on cost or technology you want to use or whatever it might be. One of the downfalls of that is sometimes developers will leave things called secrets, which allow access to those potential operating systems or environments, and they leave them on both clouds, which could lead to cross-cloud leakage. So being able to understand the paths between clouds and the identities of who can do that is a critical piece of doing zero trust in the cloud, which maps very well to the identity portion of one of the pillars of zero trust. You have to understand your identities in the cloud. They're very different than identities in an on-premise data center world, on a phone, on a laptop. You got to be able to understand where lateral movement can actually happen between cloud providers.
Sure. And I want to get into that whole identity and access control question. But just an aside, does the Wiz platform work with services that the clouds themselves provide to give that security or zero trust, whatever functions they need to achieve that? Or you pretty much need the platform because the clouds don't offer that natively?
Yes, the clouds really don't offer a comprehensive solution for looking at security risk in the cloud. And that's really the big gap that Wiz has filled in the market and why we're on such a rocket ship trajectory. We're able to provide the same experience and extract away the underlying cloud providers to show you that path from one cloud to another, to show you the inventory regardless of the cloud. When we look at, hey, show me all of the virtual machines I'm using, we don't have to do that for a particular cloud provider. We can show you across all your cloud providers that Wiz is connected to. It helps us really to do what we call democratizing security. You don't have to be an expert in security in AWS, Azure, and Google in order to get value and reduce your security risk with Wiz.
Yes, so that supports the idea that we've heard from, federal people themselves is don't assume the cloud will take care of security for you because your stuff's in the cloud. You need to maintain that visibility, as you mentioned, into, but also control over your own cybersecurity regardless of whether it's in the cloud or somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that's the shared responsibility model where the cloud provider is absolutely responsible for certain security controls. One of those is, hey, do they lock their data center? Well, you're going to assume the answer to that is yes, right? So there's certain controls that we are going to consume from those cloud providers. The ones we are not is where Wiz fills the gap. And that is really about how you configure the cloud provider's services, your workloads, the users, the identity, the access. That's where we come in and provide a comprehensive view across all those clouds to really fill the gaps of where the cloud provider ends and you as a government agency begin.
And let's get into that aspect you mentioned a few moments ago, and that is the visibility into identity and access controls. And this is a huge component of the zero trust architecture and kind of thinking. And tell us how Wiz works there. And I imagine you're going to mention not just for people, but also anything that has an IP address that's going from point A to point B.
Yeah, we're really concerned with what we would call lateral movement in the cloud. And identity is very different than on-prem world. In an on-prem world, usually access to workloads or operating systems is locked down at that OS or you off to somewhere else. So it's very known and structured and they have visibility there. In the cloud services and resources, VMs, Bedrock AI, S3 buckets, all of those have permissions and access and what they call roles, which is a form of identity. It gets very complex to understand that and who has access. So one of the things that Wiz is able to do is integrate with your IDP, like Okta or Azure AD, and we can say down to the person who has access to this resource and what are their permissions. But more importantly, who has admin access but never uses it or their account is deactivated and they don't use multi-factor authentication. We're really looking for very high risk components that we find in those clouds. So we want to identify things that could lead to a breach, to a ransomware attack, to data being exfiltrated and compromised. That's what we're really focused on, is prioritizing where identity is getting you into a really bad situation.
And that identity then can extend to devices or database calls, that kind of thing, not necessarily a human being looking to do some transaction on that application.
Exactly. We're really looking at the plumbing that the government builds to support those applications. So we can see where there might be an ability for a hacker to laterally move from an exposed container that they've gotten into a database because of excessive permissions at the identity layer. So really map that identity, and we can also tell the user of Wiz, did we find PII or PHI or CUI or other sensitive data? And those are the sort of things we want to focus on when we have time on our day to reduce our security risk versus the traditional method of let's fix all the CVEs, right? That CVEs are important, but we have to prioritize those in terms of the impact to the agency and how at risk they're putting themselves.
Sounds like there's a little bit of artificial intelligence in there.
Not necessarily.
All right.
We believe right now that the AI that is out there to build out that sort of like, hey, what's happening? AI is very dependent on the quality and size of the data you have. Getting data from customers to build that out is a non-starter for almost every one of our customers. So still today, we strongly believe the best threat intel is human intel. So majority of what we're looking for is based on attacks that have actually happened in the wild from our threat researchers, from other threat researchers, from other partners that we have. So when we're building these sort of, hey, look at this into the platform, we're getting that from good old human intel.
All right. And this, backing upstream a little bit from access controls and so forth, is just the idea of continuously monitoring your networks, something agencies have been striving to do now for going on to 25 years. And then you need to do that again, not just in your data centers anymore, but in this multi cloud world where you're workloads actually might exist. So discuss the idea of continuous monitoring and assessment of trust in, again, this infrastructure people are dealing with in the multi-clouds.
Yeah, and I think cloud is the perfect fit for continuous anything. And the reason for that is the cloud is built on APIs. So everyone uses APIs to either spin up cloud infrastructure, get information from the cloud. Wiz uses APIs. That's how we get this information. We're not installing agents on every workload. You can't install an agent on the cloud itself. We're calling the APIs of the cloud providers to continuously monitor for misconfigurations, for secrets, for vulnerabilities, for are we meeting the STIGs or meeting the NIST controls. We do that on a 24-hour basis, which is probably worlds better than most ATOs are done, which is sometimes every 3 years. But we are continuously monitoring the cloud for those areas of risk to help in that endeavor of looking at continuous monitoring and assessing for continuous risk.
I guess the subset of that is the idea of the lateral movement among clouds or within a cloud would be something that would be hard to monitor without something like your tool. Tell us about lateral movement and visibility into what's going on there, which can be a clue, I think, for an agency for a lot of things they need to know about.
Yes, one of the I don't know if it's a downfall of cloud, but one of the promises of cloud is we give anyone the ability, or we want to give folks the ability to spin up infrastructure as well at will. It's supposed to be very elastic. We want to be able to spin things up and down for various reasons, either for scale or for cost savings. So there's a lot of permissions that need to be given to do that. And sometimes developers or infrastructure as code engineers or SREs might not know all the ramifications of the permissions they're giving out to these resources, which could lead to lateral movement. So one of the things you really want to understand in your environment, does this role that I'm creating that allows someone to spin up infrastructure need all those permissions? Am I over permissive? And when we can analyze that, we'll usually see, look, if you get access to this machine because it has so many permissions, someone could then start to move through the environment with those permissions by creating other infrastructure or moving over to another piece of existing infrastructure because of those permissions they have. So you want to identify the excessive permissions that you have in the environment and be able to give that to the person who can fix that and give that into language they understand. But it's really about democratizing security, because sometimes these folks don't understand the ramifications of what they're doing. And Wiz is all about democratizing that and give them the information they need to fix that security hole right away.
And you mentioned that Wiz does not place an agent on every device in every cloud resource, because that's not really possible. Maybe briefly describe the architecture of the product, how it does work.
Absolutely. So what Wiz does is we will call the customer will allow us when we connect Wiz. We don't deploy Wiz. There's nothing to deploy. We connect to their cloud environment, and we will have them run a script which allows us to do read access to their API. And from there, what we'll do is we'll start to ask the API a bunch of questions. Show me all the Amazon services you're using. Show me all the VMs. Show me all the containers. And we iterate through. We start to build out what's called an inventory for Wiz. And once we have that inventory, we begin to assess it. We begin to assess it for risk. And we start looking for critical vulnerabilities on the workloads, misconfigurations, any secrets, and the same for the cloud services. My S3 bucket's misconfigured. Then my databases have too much permissions. So we're really going through that inventory and starting to assess it for risk, so we can start to build out what we call critical issues. And a critical issue to us is a combination of risk factors. Having a VM with a CVE on it is something you might want to look at, but having a VM with a critical CVE on it, exposed to the internet with a secret with excessive permissions, is really bad. So we'll mark that a critical issue, which we call a toxic combination. And that's really the Wiz way. It's prioritizing the risk in your cloud. So if you have 2 hours in your day to focus on security, fix that critical issue before you go tackle the thousands of CVEs you have to patch.
And the cloud APIs are architected themselves in such a way that they are open to these types of queries?
Yes, absolutely. All the cloud providers have APIs that allow you to do many, many different things because it's really one of the promises of cloud. APIs allow you to automate. So many of our customers leverage those same APIs to spin up new infrastructure, spin it down, create architectures on demand. We're doing the same thing, but we're really trying to understand the security posture of their workloads using those same APIs.
All right, understood. And what form does this information come to the operator in? Wiz is running, things are happening. Your cyber staff, your network operations, is it your security operations? Who gets what kind of information?
Ideally for Wiz, all the above. In traditional security tooling, you go ask a developer, hey, do you have access to security tooling A? And the answer is usually no, I'm not allowed to. Wiz wants to verticalize security. Instead of being horizontal, where security tools live in the different teams, like the developers have their security tool, the compliance team has their security tool, the SOC has their security tool, the vulnerability management has their security tool. We want to make that horizontal across all the teams so we can correlate all that risk together. So for us, ideally, multiple users are getting the data out of Wiz that helps them fix the things that they're responsible for, or at the CISO level, they're getting the visibility they need so they can go tell the folks that have the ability to fix those things.
That kind of supports the trend we hear about is the integration, if you will, or the combination of the network operations center and the security operations center. It becomes a single entity in some ways.
Absolutely. Sometimes we'll look at risk in a bubble, and we really want to be able to correlate different risk factors together to get the context that we need. That's one of the most key points of the Wiz way is we're going to give you focus, essentially focus on this critical issue. We're going to give you a context on, hey, this is why Wiz thinks this is something you should look at. And here's the potential impact it could have to your agency. It's
And
really about that focus, that in that context, and then eventually getting clarity, getting that issue to the team that can actually fix it.
And you mentioned integration with Okta, which gets to the idea that so many agencies, and they talk about this all the time, have a lot of tools running. They have SIM tools, they have zero trust security solutions, endpoint security, identity, MDMs, and all of these things. How do you integrate with those, and what's the best way to kind of get some kind of control or abstraction of all of that so that the operators don't go crazy and they can get a single point of information for what they need to do?
Yeah, a lot of teams have built a lot of their knowledge off seams, and Wiz can send these same critical issues off to those seams, and sometimes that's great because they can add and correlate things that maybe Wiz can't. Like there could be certain things that Wiz does not scan and does not see. I'll give you an example. Maybe a hardware router or something like that, or a hardware firewall. Those are things that Wiz traditionally does not look at. So there's other sources that seam might have information about that they correlate together. Of course, with IDPs like Okta, we complement those very well, where we can look at the identities from Okta that are consuming cloud resources. We can even look at the security posture of Okta itself. So depending on the solution, the tool, sometimes Wiz can send off the data we have to enrich what that tool does, or sometimes we actually look at the security of those tools themselves to make sure they're being consumed in a way that doesn't leave an agency at risk. An example of that could be AI technologies. So everyone's talking about AI, Bedrock, Vertex, Gemini. Wiz will actually look at the security posture of those AI solutions. Is someone training a model with an S3 bucket that's exposed to the internet and that has PII? You might want to know about that. Or just quite simply, when I get back to inventory, who is using the AI services in the cloud? Who's using Vertex Bedrock? Who's using Hugging Face on their virtual machine or in a container? We have the ability to understand the inventory of AI assets as well. So depending on the solution that's out there, there are various ways that Wiz would integrate or work with it, or look at the security of it.
All right. Well, you've given us a lot to think about. I want to thank today's guest. Is Chris Saunders is the leader of Public Sector Solutions Engineering at Wiz. Chris, good having you with us.
Thank you so much.
I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. You've been listening to Accelerate Together, Zero Trust. For more on this series, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Wiz.